Okay, I think it's almost 10 o'clock. So, okay, and hopefully everybody got the slides and the recording. So, and we did about 60 slides last time, and I think if I can do 60 more in 2 hours, that would be a good, pace, and then we can be finished on time. And just to revise, last time we talked about the Indus Valley civilization and the linguistic link between the Indo-European languages and as to how and we touched upon the early aspect of ocean trade via the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. Okay, and that's what incited my interest. Uh, okay, and now I mentioned this in the introduction about the Ashoka. Now, just to segue, the timing was determined from the visit of Alexander by the Orientalist or the East India Company officials who were polymaths. And that's when they determined that, because as I mentioned earlier, Indians are notorious in not writing down because they memorize everything. Okay. Now, you may not remember this, but I mentioned Ashoka means absence of remorse. And he was the grandson of the founder of the Maurya dynasty. Okay. And that started in the foothills of Himalayas and was successful enough to capture territory all the way from modern day Afghanistan to northern Bactria, all the way to halfway to the southern borders of India. And he was not, he believed in the earlier doctrine called Jainism that we talked about. There were the two schools of independent thought that arose in opposition to the classic Brahminic culture. And now the grandson Ashoka, he wanted to expand his uh, empire to a relatively small to medium sized independent uh, state on the Bay of Bengal side. And and the war was very brutal, as they usually are, and as many as 150,000 people died, and so many people were captured as, were homeless. And when he toured it, he developed remorse, which is unusual for a winning side king. Okay. And that is the story that is unique, one would say, in the history, because I don't think Stalin or Churchill felt sorry for the destruction that they created, or Napoleon for that matter. And that is when he ran into a Buddhist monk and had literally a conversion from being a warrior king, to pious, dharma or religious, preacher. And and obviously the state sponsorship goes a long way. And for after first 2 or 3 years, he just traveled, and lived in humble style and directed his own thing. But then he decided that, yes, this makes sense. So I should try to promote this religion, not just in India alone, but across the other borders. He started sending out emissaries, including his own children, initially to the closest part, that is Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called. The name was, Tamraputra, or different name in those times. But so that was a big thing. And this is the first time Indian kings started writing things down. Now, obviously, the paper had not traveled from China, so the carvings were done on the rock side or mountainside at various places all over the subcontinent. And he also built something called stupas, which you can say this is like the round dome type structures, which is, a part of relic of Buddha or worship place, not a worship place inside, but they were created, as many as thousands of them. Okay. And this, And now, ironically, all this was totally lost to the Indian culture for 2000 years. Believe it or not, how one can lose a whole track of history. And that is when I first read this, it just blew my mind that, that we had lost. Because obviously in high school, it was reintroduced that, yeah, we always knew about it, sort of thing. This was glossed over, trying to get the national identity. But this is, a book that I think, if anybody's interested as to how the English Enlightenment, the book is called Ashoka, The Search for the Lost Emperor. This is a popular historian who is an English guy named Charles Allen. And it's almost reads like a detective story. I mean, it just blew my mind that these were people who are administrators, like a middle level administrators for the starting East India Company, where they established the foothold in modern day Calcutta on the border between Burma and India. And then the Clive, they got a lot of revenue from the failing Mughal Empire. And in their free time, they were interested in archaeology, linguistics, and other, explorations. And and then obviously they had some of them were placed for trade in Burma, some were placed in Sri Lanka, which they had managed to capture from the Dutch with the settlement of the Dutch and British wars. And they kicked the Dutch out, and then they took over Sri Lanka. So they would get over this archaeological this thing, and they were able to find the linguistic links between the native languages which had evolved from Sanskrit, on the mountainside. Okay. And this was the so-called Brahmi script, which is kind of a little derivation from Sanskrit as languages evolved over 500 years. And they kept coming across a name called Priyadarshini, means beloved of the gods. Okay. And based on this, that's this name keeps appearing. Who that is? Who is that? And finally, they compared the notes from foothills of Himalayas, from the stupas in Burma, from Sri Lanka, and from the west coast of India. They were able to put, there were some dates written down. I sent letters to Ptolemy and to, Seleucid, the Greek satrapa. And based on that, they were able to determine the time that this Priyadarshana must have been the grandson of the founder of this Maurya dynasty. And so this is, really an amazing story by the linguistic princeps who was studied the, Kharosthi and Brahmi. Brahmi was the Indian script, and Kharosthi was the script between Persia and northern India, or Afghanistan, modern day. So this was, collaborated, and they were also based on coins. They were able to put the timing together. So that's how they, the search for the lost emperor. So it's just a fascinating, scholarship of enlightenment, and the primarily almost British, and then later on some French and German scholarship as well, because that was the ray of Orientalism, which was popular with linguistics and archaeology in Western Europe at that time. And it lasted only for about 20 or so years, from 1790 to 1910, because with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon, Egypt became very popular, and Rosetta Stone, that's another story. Okay. And these are the rock edicts, as you can see that, hopefully you can see that they're all over. From Kandahar is very much apparent of the name hasn't changed. And the center is, at that time, Delhi was relatively a small establishment. This is the area, I'm sorry. Yeah, where, the Mauryan capital was. And this was mentioned in the Indica by Megasthenes, who traveled, shortly after Alexander. And this is, the coast, Arabian coast, the western side. So, and this, he defines the principles of dharma as nonviolence, tolerance toward all sects, obedience to parents, other religious teachers, friends, and human treatment of servants and everybody else. So it's really basically, you can just say this is the golden rule 300 years before, but, it just for a royalty to do that, that was impressive. Okay. And I'll have, and then this was, welded together in different scripts, not just Brahmi and the native languages, but also in Aramaic and Greek. So these edicts were, so he made sure that everybody was able to understand what he was preaching. Okay. Now this may come as a surprise to you that yes, there are lions in India. Okay. And this is pretty much in Western India, a relatively small part. The Indian lions are relatively smaller than Africans. And this is the rock edict. This is on the side of, you can just see, hopefully you can see that. Obviously, I can't read the script, but that this was translated by the scholars, that perhaps if it's on paper, I may be able to make out. Okay. And this is still the lion's population with the hunting that was popular amongst the Maharajas and the Brits. Okay. The lion population was being decimated, but now with conservation, it has increased to about 500 or so. And that's a, nice park there. Okay. And the lions have figured widely that this was one of the digs that was found when the Archaeology Association of British India explored. And so the lions have been adopted in the Indian flag and national emblem, the chakra of the wheel of Buddha, and along with 4 lions, that's a symbol on Indian currency. And these are the varieties of stupas, and I'll have several examples of it. You can just see that these are made of rock and stones with ornamental gateways and intricate carving. And that is still very much, it is very well preserved dome that is still around. So you could say this was probably constructed around, 200 BC, 200 to 300 before the current era. Okay. And this is worth reading because I just would think that this blows your mind. No living being made. So this is non-violence before Gandhi. Okay. It is in the Priyadarshina, that was his own, name for himself, arranged for medical treatment, is ordered to inspect dharma means religion, basically, in addition to regular duty. And shamanas were monks, were people who went, mendicants, basically, and who went around and promotes dharma and expects descendants to wise path. Yavanas was a word for Greeks, basically. So that was the people who are foreigners, so to speak. Cambodia as well. These are the Gandhara was modern day Afghanistan. Okay. And these were other smaller kingdoms further to the south that were not under his total control. Okay. And in some, okay, be brought to the notice at any time, period. So quick trial. Okay. Should live in peace and self-control and purity of mind. And Bodhigaya was the pilgrimage of the Buddhist side of Buddhist teaching, where he got the enlightenment. Okay, and this what called Stramanas are the preachers of the Jain community. Okay. Okay, I think this is the last one. So. Sorry, it's a busy slide, but I think, you can just read it easily rather than me reading the slides, and it will be there on the slides that I sent out, because, and this is just one of the many thousands of rock carvings or edicts, So the tolerance was, preached. It was another equally important part. Okay. Now, unlike as I may not have mentioned, but unlike other religions, Buddhism allowed women to be ordained as preachers. So this was an equally a thing that they could adopt. So that was totally opposite to the classical Hinduism, where women were considered, property and had to obey, I know, either their fathers and husbands and sons and so on and so forth. So this was a quite departure that they were, you know, much more tolerant towards equality of two sexes. Now, in the foothills of modern-day Central Asia, the tribes, which are nomadic tribes, called Yuezhi, Y-E-U-Z-H-I, they migrated with the uh, conquest of the Han Chinese into the Tarim Basin, and they migrated further south into Central Asia and modern-day Afghanistan area, and succeeded, obviously, and with the local weakness. Now, as it happens after the emperor, the subsequent generations were not as good rulers. So the fractures were appearing, and the kingdom that the nomadic people established a foothold and then gradually expanded over a few centuries, called Kushan Empire. And this was truly a cultural amalgamation between Greek, Roman, Buddhist, and Hindu. Okay, and you can just see that from the coinage. Okay, that you can just see the styling is more Greek than and then and it's obviously written in the local script, and the style and the statues which were carved were also robust Greek type of influence. You can see that carrying a big sword and a big tunic type that is not a traditional Indian uh, dressing. And then some of the other kings had written in Greek Boddo, Bodo. So that just said, so this is the first historical evidence. And some of the stone carvings that were said, that you can just see from the cultural thing, seated Buddha and the halo, and you can just see that that is the Western influence that that was depicted. Okay, and again, seated Buddha with other attendants from the Kushan period, and uh, this was excavated in the heartland of the Hindu religion, Siri, south of Delhi. Okay, so they, and this was tolerated. So both cultures were simultaneously coexisted. Okay, and then later on, again it happens that, like many times, that the local, this was the, now this name you may recognize, the Bagram Air Force Base. That was a major Air Force base during the Afghan War. Peshawar is in Pakistan, and this is Mathura, which is where the statue that I showed you earlier. And Sarnath was where Buddha had his enlightenment. So, and then other kingdoms were arising, which were, you know, the around 5th century. So you can just see that in 300 years, other polities arose in the Indo-Gangetic plain, and and then and then at that time the Kushan Empire was running out of steam. Okay, and again this statue just showed that this is the Gandhara Buddha style. So you can just see maybe as well wearing a Roman toga type thing. So, and just for comparison, this is the thing of name you may recognize. So there is substantial similarities between the Hellenistic robe, okay, and the Roman robe. So it just shows the Greek-Roman influence that permeated. Okay, and I showed this earlier, but this is a better image type of thing, that you can see the intricate carving that is still very much there, and is a big pilgrimage site for not so much as just the Indians, but the Japanese, Chinese, Koreans. So a lot more East Asians come there, in and it's not just pilgrimage, but they going around, the circumambulation and meditation are a big religious pilgrimage sites in northern India. And again, some of the more examples of the Buddha, in the Mathura versus Gandhara style. So it just shows how the cultural similarities existed between the Greek and the traditional Indian carving. Okay. And not only that, there are some other beliefs, like the sort of in between word called yaksha, means that in the fertility goddess and other these things that collaborated. And you can just see that some of the and the styling is a lot more mixed cultural, and and this and then afterwards an event took place in the Mediterranean that had a huge impact later on. There was 100 current era, and there was a place called the Battle of Antietam, okay, and that took place between Augustus and Cleopatra, and that just changed the control of Egypt, came under a Roman control, and that had a huge impact on increasing the trade via the Red Sea, because in just place of instead of just 100 ships that were traveling from the Red Sea to Arabian Ocean to the west coast of India, as many as 1,000 ships per year started traveling, and the trade just proliferated with the because they did not have to deal with the Persians and the nomadic Arab pirates in the Arabian Sea. And obviously that and the route was also become relatively a little shorter because they're a lot more safe, you know. And obviously that was costly for businessmen because they had to buy insurance and and obviously the weather was, but they had figured out the sea route, which was much more manageable. Now, as just like in Christianity, the Buddhism divided into two schools of thought. I mentioned that a little bit, but I just thought I would elaborate on it. The Theravada was the traditional, much more rigid way of thinking that took place, and only through the teaching of Sangha, and there was the and okay, and this was a lot more harder for lay people. And the Mahayana was the Tibetan type of school that developed, which was you can stay in your normal living and family life, and at the same time, if you do good deeds, and at the same time, it's almost reminded me of the giving homage to Pope type of thing. Said, okay, you just support the monks or the who are coming with a begging bowl, or support their colonies called viharas, which was almost like their dormitory of the monks, of the men and women, and you would collect good deeds. And so there were thousands of viharas, or almost dormitories, which were built for the male and female monks. Okay, and so that's how that was a lot more acceptable. Okay, and gradually with good deeds, we acquire a good karma, and releasing yourself from the circle of uh, birth and death. Okay, and so this were and the concepts actually amalgamated between the Brahminic Hindu thinking as well as the Buddhist thinking. Okay, and by this time, as you can see, that the Kushan Empire was on the northwestern border, and by that time, the Upper Silk Route was becoming a lot more manageable because of the trade, and the Han Chinese had conquered the desert route, and so people were able to travel by land as well as by sea. So the full circle was completed, and a lot of the Chinese scholars started coming down from the northern route. Now, at the same time, with the state sponsorship, varieties of cave carvings were done. And as opposed to the earlier rock carvings, which were more esoteric, like a tree or Buddha's footprint, this was more like a celebration of life. You can see that this caves which are in Western India, you can see that the carving are a lot more, so-called mudras or positioning, and with gold and crown, and and varieties of depiction of daily life. These caves were built somewhere in the 2nd and 1st century CE. Okay, and these are huge tourist attraction. That this was like like about 40 or 50 caves that are there. And this again became operational only for about a few hundred years because climate and the weather change and the change of the central authority, that is the rise of Islam, these were abandoned. It was interestingly that these were discovered accidentally around 1810 current era by one of the Englishmen named with a very common name called John Smith. He was out hunting and he stumbled upon chasing either a tiger or boar and saw these caves. And just like it happens, John Smith was here. He covered on the things. And then later on, the British Archaeological Association did a systematic exploration of the caves. And they were just amazed as to how deep they were and how many of the caves there were. So there was a big archaeological findings, okay, that took place. And this cave building continued for several hundred years, okay, and it shows the Mahayana Buddhist motifs with elaborate architecture as well as figurative representation of Buddha and the various avatars of Buddha that took place. Okay, and these are, for sake of time, I did not put video clips, but these are the links for those of you who want to avoid traveling to the subcontinent. Okay, and you can just see okay, let me see if I can magnify this. Okay, and these are extremely well preserved, still. And at the end of this lake cave, and these are rock carvings. Okay, and these are monastic retreats for Buddhist monk. Okay, and some of them are made with woods, and people actually lived there in those caves. Okay. And the cave building continued for several centuries. Okay. And these are similar caves. You can just see and these are large. Okay, a chaitya or a meditation hall, which is the 15-foot sculpture of seated Buddha. Okay, and varieties of ceilings. Okay. And this is carved from a single stone from top down. You can just see the carving. It's called Ellora Cave. These are monasteries, about 34 monasteries, but dug side by side from the side of the cliff. This is again in central India. Okay, that's part of the Western Ghats, which is the mountain range. Okay, and this mountain range is an interesting history that some people thought that the weather change might have something to do with the collapse of the dinosaurs, but that's another subject. Okay, so and this continued, the whole civilization, the culture was brought to life in the cave carvings. Okay. And again, all the three religions are equally represented: Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. So they were not partial to one or the other. And again, you can just see the extent of it compared to the size of the people. And this is just carved top down, basically. Okay, and this continued from 6th century to almost 11th century. Okay, because by that time the northern part was coming under the Muslim conquest, but still the south was left relatively untouched. So this was, it's like a subcontinent, north and south was under different political control. Okay, and this is one of the largest monolithic top-down rock excavation. Okay, and it symbolizes the Hindu belief of the holy mountain, like, again, you can see obviously the proverbial elephant and the carvings on the side. So, and I think,
what's the name?
I'm sorry, this is Ellora, Ellora, Ellora Cave. There's the Argentine Ellora Cave. They're both, I should say, about 100 or so miles east of Bombay or Mumbai. So they're in central India because that part is rocky. So that's where, and it's a huge tourist thing. So, okay. So if somebody flies to Bombay, then the tours are, I'm sorry.
Can't remove the bar.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can move that. Yeah. I didn't realize. Okay, I think it's gone now, so I'll find it.
Where has this been all my life? Never
What?
heard of this.
Yeah. Oh, I think like that's this. Yeah, am surprised. Yeah, that because usually a lot of the and part of it was this was it didn't make the okay. This may be one video, so I think this may be worth showing. So
There are 22 rock-cut caves at Bhaja, facing the valley of the river Indrayani in Pune district.
this
The
Central
Chaitya
India.
Griha, or prayer hall here, was made in the 2nd century BC. Chaitya means an object of worship. The stupa, deep inside, continues as the focus of devotion. The mortal relics of the Buddha had been enshrined in a number of stupas. For Buddhists, the stupa became the symbol of his passage from the world of illusion and pain to that of eternal bliss. A horseshoe-shaped arch dominates the facade of the cave. The shape was first made in imitation of wooden architecture in the Barabar caves of the Ajivikas. Soon it was to be a pan-Indian motif in Buddhist, Jaina, and Brahminical monuments. The scale of the hall is impressive. It is 55 feet by 26 feet and rises to a height of 29 feet. Pillars which run along the walls of the cave provide a circumambulatory passage around the stupa. The pillars lean inwards in imitation of wooden architecture. Above, wooden ribs have actually been added to copy the appearance of freestanding buildings.
Okay, so that was just a small clip type thing, but so that gives you an idea. Now, this was supported by traders because obviously, if you are pray and donate to the religious things, your journey is blessed, so to speak. So this was a sort of a business write-off, perhaps one can say, being cynical about it. That this and not only the Hindus at the locals, but also the foreign merchants, including Greeks and Egyptians, donated it also because again they had the interest in getting their trip blessed. Okay, and this has been documented. So, okay, now this obviously you may recognize the name here. Everybody remembers this one? I'm sorry? Yeah, the Bamiyan. Oh, yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, sorry, that funny. Yeah, this is, I'm trying to, oh, okay, I think, yeah, so now the Bamiyan Buddha, you may remember that from the Taliban, right? Okay, this was blown up, I think so. And this was built around, in the Kushan era, which I talked about, the Kushan Empire. And so this was, and it really took them a lot of effort to blow this up, I think so. But the crazy, the religious fanatic, they succeed, And there is some effort at restoring it that is being done. And also, and then the Buddhism, Ashoka sent his own son. Sorry, I hope it's not magnified yet. No, it's not. You can read it, right? Okay. And he sent his own son and envoys to the West. And then obviously, he was friendly with the local king or Raja. So he converted. And obviously, and that was the start of the Sri Lankan Buddhist culture. And that is still, I mean, as I was listening, I was just listening about the infighting that went on between the, hi, okay, all right. Okay, so the Tamil Sri Lankan war that lasted for about 7 or 8 years, type of thing, and that So the conflict between the Hindu Tamils, the South Indians who migrated, to Sri Lanka, and the Buddhist culture. And again, this figures loudly in terms of Portuguese control of the Buddhist relics in Sri Lanka. The Buddha's tooth is there, and then the Brits, and it was sent to Burma. So Sri Lankans were very instrumental in spreading the Hinayana type of Buddhism from Sri Lanka to Burma and Southeast Asia. So different type of proselytizing took place from the south than from the north. From the north, the spread was occurring from Bengal to Tibet and to China, and by land route. So you can see how the religious spread from different groups. And the excavation was done in under the Bagram area. Obviously, this was before, during the Afghan King era, by the French in 1930s. And these were some of the things that were excavated. The ivories, sculptures, the Buddhist chambers, various bronzes, Greco-Roman. And this is, let's see if I can, and you can just see that it might help to read Boddo, Bodo, that I mentioned about. And again, you can see the combination of cultures that took place. Okay. Okay. And there are also glass vessels that were found. So the trade was both ways. Okay. Let me just see. I think I might have that. Yeah. This is bidirectional trade. Okay. So you can see Egyptian glass, Roman glassware, because obviously, what did the Romans send? The Italians sent wine, okay, and glass. So this was their export, okay, let's see, go back to something. And so these are a Roman origin. It shows gladiator and other sculptures along with this. So, okay, and ivories are, okay. And there are about thousands of ivory, Buddhist and Indian ivories have been were excavated by the French. Okay, and this work was done by the French archaeologist. Okay, and so you can just see that the styling is clearly very European. Now, this was something is goofy. I think my notes are blocked up. Okay, yeah. Now this is long before, in 1492, Columbus, 1498, Vasco da Gama. Okay. Now way before that, around 110, before the current era, a Greek navigator named Eudoxus, he had traveled through the Arabian Sea, it was via the Red Sea and the African exploration. And it was Eudoxus of, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. You feel free to you can correct me how to pronounce this word. Okay, but his name was Eudoxus, and he was working for the Ptolemies, and wrote a book that we'll talk about in just a second. Okay, so he's a Greek navigator, and was written in what the Oriental scholars are rather crude Greek. It was written like a sailor's manual. It was not in classic Greek. Okay, like the plays of the Western culture highlight plays. So it was written as a manual for the sea guide. So exploration of the Arabian Sea, you can just see from the map type thing. Okay, and the book is called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Erythraean is Red Sea basically, and where he describes from traveling from you can just see it from the Mediterranean. Initially, the short passage was by land, okay, and then the goods were transported to the various two ports, the two ports which were very much, okay, let's see if I can show them without, okay, and the ports are Bernisi, Berniki, and Myos Hermos. So these are at the mouth of the Red Sea. And these were the big two trading ports which were quite active. And this was the so-called Ethiopian empire that was there. This is way before Islam, or way before Christianity even, Adelus, So the trade went through the Red Sea, and this is modern day Aden, okay, and continued all the way to the number of ports that are on the coast of India. And this is modern day Oman and the coast of Pakistan. Okay. So it gives you an idea. And then and the Roman ships did travel not just to the west coast, but also some of them had traveled all the way on the east coast also. And this was, and this avoided the land journey. So it avoided the harder travel around the, tip of India because the sea can be more turbulent there. So this was written, and one of the big port that is mentioned is Baragaza. And this figures widely in all the Greek writings of Strabo and Pliny as the big trading port. And these were on the basis of the river that were there. Now these ports are no longer functional because they've all been silted with the drainage that comes from the interiors. So, and this is where pretty near where Bombay is modern day. And that was, now this is an interesting story of Bombay that we talked about from the island of the Nutmeg Island. The Brits got Manhattan in a trade with, I mentioned that last time, they got a good bargain. The same way the island of Bombay was given as part of dowry from the Portuguese king to the King James in Britain. So that's how they got the island. And there was a better seaport at that time. So the trade practically just moved because there was, and you can see the number of the ports that were there. And this was just amazing that all these names were, different to me type of thing. So I just entered this on ChatGPT and was able to translate all this name within like 10 seconds, the power is just amazing as to how quickly there was, and obviously none of these was taught to us in school type of thing, because obviously, this is a lot more detailed history that, okay. So this was, okay. And he describes very well as to now whether did he actually travel along with the Ethiopian kingdoms down the coast of Africa or not. There is some conjecture that he may have gone around the African coast, but that's not very well proven. I think so. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. Okay, there's a lot more description in the notes, but I think just for the sake of time, I'm not going to dwell too much into it. And these are some of the sculptures excavated in Ethiopia. You can just see that there's cultural influence amalgamated. And what included in the trade? Just cotton, pepper, precious stones, animals, and last but not the least, slaves. Okay, the slave trade continued on both sides. That from Africa the slaves were taken to Rome, and at the same time some of them were brought to India, and vice versa. Okay, so this was, and you can see some of the styles were much more African looking. Then so there are three big principalities that are involved. The African kingdom of the coast of modern day Ethiopia, Rome, and India. So it was a triangular trade. Now this is interesting that one of the papyrus which was discovered in the modern times, it's a 2nd century AD Greek document. It shows, this has been translated based on Rosetta Stone. Okay, this is called the Muziris Papyrus. Okay, and that gives a document the Roman spice trade from port in what is modern day Kerala, which is the southernmost state of India, which has a lot of multiple ethnic population, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu, and that state, it was, just to segue sideways, that was the only communist state, start from 1955 onwards. The communists ruled it, and Prime Minister Nehru could not, had to tolerate it, type of thing. So that trade had huge trade that went on with Alexandria, and this has been well documented. And not only that, in this papyrus, shipping invoice has been found. Ship's name, they were able to find the name of the ship called Hermepolon, which revealed the logistics, how it was financed, what were the customs, how much did the Roman government took in tax? About 25%, not small amount. And so the tariffs have a long history, and included pepper, ivory, it included the vast, complex of wealth that was, okay, I'm sorry. Finally, I have moved the taskbar to my side. Okay. Now it was blocking me, so I had to move it. And this papyrus is in the Museum of Vienna. Okay. Okay. And this was the invoice, so I don't know if you can read it, is a fragmentary document. Okay. 500 pepper, you know, various ivory fragments, tortoise shells. I don't know why there were so much of tortoise shells. What did they use for? I had no idea, but and this is some type of a perfume, which I had to look up the word nard. Okay, it was a Himalayan perfume. Okay, okay, and this was, the total value reaches about 9.2 million, which is, around 90 million euros. So, and this is just one ship. And as I mentioned a little while ago, there were like, in a year, about 1,000 ships traveled across. Okay. Okay. And this is in, the mosaic in Sicily, in one of the walls. You can just see that the influence of the Indian tigers, and just, and various yakshi, which is the Hindu religious, sort of, symbolism that translated. Okay. And some of the perfumes have also been mentioned later on in the Bible as well. Okay. Okay. And then, and this was during the Pompeii, after the eruption of in 1938. This was a statue that was discovered. Okay. And you can see the styling is not exactly European. You can just say it's a very traditional Indian carving. Yakshi, the goddess of wealth, and this is ivory. Was dated as circa 1st century current era. Okay. And these are similar figures have been found, in Bagram as well as northern India. Okay. Now, in between, this was like a sort of free trade port, circa similar to Hong Kong or Singapore, modern day Singapore. Okay. This was an island of Sokotra. I'm sorry. Oops. What did I do? Oh, I hit the wrong button. Okay, I'm sorry, I think. Okay, yeah, I think we're in business again. Let me make sure that I get my setting correct. Sorry about that. Okay, share two. Okay, now you should have this. Okay, we're in business. Okay, there is a small island off the coast of Arabia, which is called Socotra, and it's still there. So it was, that was like a stopping port for, for the sailors. Okay, the tailors from the west coast of India went, and in these caves over there, they found graffiti, in Sanskrit as well as in other languages from Malaya, India, Arabs, and Rome. Okay, and this is almost, so they were able to identify the names of the sailor and their occupation. So and so sailor. Okay, and this was, sort of north of Madagascar, so almost at the mouth of the Red Sea. So, and this is a cave that, and they found, varieties of trade goods as well as, their leftover signatures, so to speak. So this was a stopping port. And this has been very well deciphered by people. Okay. So, and again, what other items that included cinnamon resin, okay, and other various perfumes, and okay, and along with spices, okay. And this was mixture not Persians, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Nabatean, Gujaratis from India, and Greeks, and so this was, and the name is Socotra, is actually originated from Sanskrit, blissful, Sukatra rib, so this was like a common trading port. Now, all of this, this is an older slide from my other talk that I said, okay, all of this was facilitated by climate. Because the monsoon winds, the temperature is different over the ocean versus land. So for thousands of years, monsoon has decided, as to how the trade will, and that just shortened the journey. People would flow along the monsoon trade winds, and we could travel from the African coast or from the Arabian coast to India, and the reverse in other direction. And similarly, when the winds and the wet clouds hit the Himalayas, and they would turn back, and the monsoon season would be different in the Bay of Bengal on this side. Okay, and so that changes. That's the other trading season that takes place. So this made it easier, not just for the Indian subcontinent, but the Southeast Asians. Remember, I showed you the slide of people had traveled. Okay, yeah, a few more minutes, because then we can take a few breaks. From all the way from Southeast Asia to Madagascar. So they're able to follow this monsoon pattern. So the weather had huge impact. And you can see, so that's almost predictable that, it's jokingly said that the Indian government, monsoon has a ministerial position. Okay. And this was so predictable, if the monsoon is a little later than mid-June, people would start offering prayers, and there'd be a panic amongst the farming communities, and unfortunately, the pattern is now changing. When I talk to people, that the rains, you could just predict that the rains would stop sometime in mid-October or so, and that would get to the festival of Diwali, where people would celebrate harvest. But that is dramatically changing. So, but that's so I'm digressing. But that's just so. Is the real was dubbed the real finance minister of India. Yeah. Okay, and this is, I may have shown this slide in the first lecture, but this is the number of Roman coins that have been found in South Asia. You can just see and these are, and from the time of Augustus, okay, that the huge hoards have been discovered. Obviously, in Europe there will be a lot more discovered. Coast of Egypt, okay. Let's see, I had a fancy pen, which I don't know if I can work here. No, I haven't figured it out yet how to use it properly. Well, I think, I have to practice on it, because. Okay. Okay. So, and in south coast of India, as many as 80,000, I'm sorry, 800,000 sesterce coins have been discovered. Now, this impressive hoard, okay, which shows the coins in different directions, gold items, and hardwood, animal skins, these have been discovered in only one, at the bottom of one temple in South India. Okay, and this was sealed for like several hundred years, and finally the temple authorities gave permission to open at least one room, and this was like a 4x3 by golden items, diamonds, precious stones, okay, about 18-foot idols made of gold, okay, and almost 30 kilograms of gold. This is, so the value of this is considered in hundreds of thousands of dollars type thing. So this, and there are still other rooms which based on religious belief, they're not allowed to open. Okay, so this is, and this was discovered only like within last few years, that okay, and this is the temple. This was the vault was, yes, I thought that was correct. Yeah, so it was 2011. Okay, so 50,000 Roman coins and gold measured in kilos. Okay, okay. And again, so some later coins have been discovered as well. Okay. And I showed this. This is sorry, I should have erased this slide. Okay. And again, this is, if anybody is a Monty Python fan who'd remember this, what have the Romans done for us? That's a skit from Monty Python. So if we just want to get some good laugh, this is like a bunch of, people in the Middle East sitting around talking. What have the Romans? Yeah, they gave us the canals, or they would do this. Yeah, but what else have they done? It's absolutely hilarious clip for if you're okay. And this is obviously a take on Dr. Seuss. So this was the biggest thing that was discovered in Arikamandu is in South India. It's on the east coast of India, which is called modern day Pondicherry. Okay. And Pondicherry has an interesting history. I will just segue into it before we stop for break. Pondicherry was the only French colony all throughout the British era. At the end of the 7-Year War between Britain and France in 1763, the French were lost, and at the peace treaty, they were forced not to expand in India. It was all left to the East India Company. Okay, but the colonies that they had, they were allowed to keep them. And they stayed there even after the Brits left in 1947. Then finally, around 1955 or so, a French government decided that they would rather concentrate on French Indochina, okay, rather than those three little colonies. On the other hand, the Portuguese were not anxious to give up their colonies, and they were anxious to hold on to Goa. And finally, when they attacked the so-called freedom marchers, then India kicked the Portuguese out, and that was the end of the hippie heaven of Goa. So this was okay, and this is Arikamandu is the court of Pondicherry. So that's just something I wanted to point out and these are the amphoras have been found. So the wine was popular, just from Persia as well as from Italy. Okay, so it got around. Okay, and these were so many coins and gourds were discovered that the British archaeology head, means Sir Mortimer, they obviously thought this was a Roman colony, that obviously the Indians did not have the wherewithal to do this sort of trade. The Romans had left all these coins, but, actually the later excavation proved that that wasn't quite, he was a little off the top. So, and that this have been found because they have found a corded ware from the Mauryan Empire. So that preceded even the Rome, so to speak. So they were able to time that, yet this precedes, it was not just, okay. I think we should stop and take a maybe 5-minute break or something. And then if anybody wants to back, and then I can continue with my monologue. Okay, let me see if I can successfully pause my recording. Okay, so, and this is a segue into the early Christian history, doubting Thomas, after Jesus' death, he was summoned to India, or he was sent, actually, he wasn't willing to go, but he was sent as an emissary to one of the kings in northern India. Okay, and there was some doubts about it, but some of the later research shows that, yes, indeed, there was somebody who did travel to South India for conversion to southern state of Kerala. And again, then later on, during some of the preaching, he was killed by some of the Brahmins, and this was he was a reluctant priest, so to speak. So there is some, evidence to his visit to South India for preaching, and, as early as, 50 current era. Okay. And again, that this is, and along the northern routes, Buddhism in China, when the Chinese decided to convert, they did it in a big way, so that's the whole next part of her story. I mean, they went out with full hands, so, and this is, from after the capture of the desert area in the Uyghur community, these are varieties of cave that have been discovered. There are varieties of major caves artifacts have been discovered in Western China, as well as, Central Plains area. So, and the famous one is called the White Horse Temple. Okay, and this And now, how did Buddhism finally get? Apparently, the myth was that one of the Chinese emperor had a dream that a preacher came on a white horse, and then one of the Buddhist monks by that time arrived, and that just well, his dream came true, and that was the start of the founding of the Buddhism. And this was again, they already had their established religions, i.e., Taoism and Confucianism. Okay, but at that time, they were under some, trouble due to invasion from the Huns. So there was a lot of cultural clash that was taking place, and that gives the incentive to look for a different faith. Okay, and now, again, after 300 or 400 years, these are some of the most meticulous and well-documented records of the two big travelers from China to India. The first one that is pronounced as Fahian, okay, traveled, you can just see what, the Buddhist monk, he traveled to the various, schools or monasteries or learning centers in the northwest part of India called Takshashila. Okay, so you can just see that this was the earliest learning centers for learning not just religious philosophy, but astronomy, mathematics, astrology, languages. So these were the big training places where thousands of students came and learned along with. They stayed there for several years. Okay, and Fahian traveled from the northern routes, to Mathura, which we talked about, which is in the central plain near south of Delhi, and Kapilvastu, where Buddha was born. Okay, and so this was, and this is obviously this is huge scores of scholarship. This is from Washington University, so there are the varieties of links. Okay, and so outward bound, he departed along the southern Silk Road. Okay, and he returned by sea from Sri Lanka all the way to Sumatra, Java. So did a full circle around. Okay. And these are some of the caves in Tibet, among some of the earliest caves.
A rich repository of Buddhist art, Mogao Caves. Dunhuang in Gansu province in China is located at a strategic point on the Silk Road. Chinese emperors competed with foreign powers continuously for control of the city. Those who seized control of Dunhuang were largely devout Buddhists. They left many statues and paintings. This tradition began in the 4th century AD and continued for around 1,000 years. The Mogao Caves consist of over 700 man-made grottos carved into a rock face stretching 1,600 meters in length. The oldest date from the early 5th century. The area at the time was controlled by the nomadic Xingnu people from the north. The artistic influence of the occupiers is clearly visible. This statue of Maitreya, for instance, is not sitting in a traditional way, but in the Xingnu cross-legged style. The artwork in this cave dates to the Tang dynasty, about 300 years later. The statue started to show more characteristics of the Chinese style. The plump faces of the Maitreya statues are full of expression. This is a painting of Amida in Pure Land Paradise. Amida worshippers believed the god lived in a Pure Land paradise in the far west and would save those who were true believers. This belief was introduced to the Dunhuang area during the 7th century. The Mogao Caves were regarded as the entrance to the Pure Land paradise. The mural of a bodhisattva preaching under a tree is a Dunhuang masterpiece. Buddhist art in the Mogao Caves progressed significantly during the Tang dynasty. Richly decorated bodhisattvas are depicted here. The excavation of the northern caves has only just begun. This plain, undecorated cave was a monk's room. Monks were mostly from peasant families and lived a humble life while praying for their family's happiness. The Mogao Caves are a treasure trove of Buddhist art,
but they are also a place with a long history of conflict and suffering. The hope and pain of countless people remain engraved here.
Okay, so this is a Japanese video. Okay, and this was one of the first caves that was excavated by a German explorer named Oral Stein, and this was around like late 19th century. Okay, and he was able to take out as many as 10,000 paintings, sutras. These were they're written, and obviously this was studied by the scholars, and so was one of the big point of cultural exchange that took place between Tibet, China, and northwestern India with this history. Okay. Okay. And these are some of the other caves in China. Okay, you can see that this is, almost in central China, that place, Yukon Cave. Okay. And again, you can just see that the architecture is, as you enter the cave, you can see this, you're faced with this massive Buddha sculpture appearing, looking directly at you. This is one of the many sculptures in rock cut art, in China. And the climate is such that it's dry, so it's preserved. And some of these parchment sutras and translations that are also well preserved compared to South India, where they would deteriorate because of the weather. And I think so. So this, in that area, so that okay, yeah, and these are looking to see some of the similar ones, so people actually, it reminds us somewhere of the caves in, of the Native American things in Arizona. Okay. Okay, and this is another Longmen grottos in China. I'm just amazed at the scale and size of it. That's just mind-boggling as to how huge that is. And now the culture is being Sinicized, as they would call it. So there, the architecture style is changing. You can see that's a totally different style of clothing as well as depiction of that takes place. And again, some of this, this was difficult because they also had the invasion from Central Asia of the tribes called Turks, so the early ancestors of Turkish people, and that came around, and some of them were attacked, but at the same time a lot of this has been still well preserved. Okay. Okay, the other famous traveler that Huan Seng, that's I think that's how it's pronounced, so he was a little later traveler than Fahian, and again, he's born 600, and he was there for almost like 20 years, traveled for searching for Buddhist text. Initially, he traveled by foot. Now, at that time, by this time, Chinese emperor had almost become close. They were not allowed to travel, but he was able to sneak by and had to travel through the Pamir Desert, okay, and ended up on the coast of India. And then obviously his translations are quite extremely useful in saying the decline of Buddhism in already taking place in India. And the causes of that are manifold. Part of it is the religion became a little bit more, rigid, so to speak, that, people, and the trade support fell down, okay, with the end of the Roman trade that took place with the Parthian conquest, okay, that support from the trading community fell down. And at the same time, and the people who joined the monks at the Buddhist monks, not all of them were as well enlightened and looking for enlightenment and converted. Some of them were kind of lazy bums who joined the religions just because they couldn't hack it in regular life. Okay, so there was a lot of discontent that was taking place, And at the same time, you can just see it looking at the time period. The conquest that was taking place was the Islam was slowly migrating into into northern India. So and obviously they did not take very kindly to any type of idol worship or stupas or temples or anything. They were bent on destroying all the idols. So that all that conflict of various, of the strong monotheistic belief of Islam came into conflict with the Buddhist, as well as, so, and at the same time, after the breakup of the Mauryan Empire, a lot of the Hindu supporting kingdoms had arisen. So that just led to the gradual decline. Last but not the least, the Buddhist teachings were only in the established language. And as language evolved over 300, 400 years, people couldn't understand what they're talking about. It's just like, if the mass is in Latin, not too many people, young people are going to want to attend. So the same thing happened, is it didn't evolve with the language. So that probably all this, lack of religious support, invasion of Islam, resurgence of Hinduism, all these factors made Buddhism almost disappear. That by the time Huan Sung came to India, he was lamenting that, the horrible religion of Hinduism has taken over. So, but he did travel, and he was able to, and still there was enough presence, all across, that he was able to take thousands of transcripts and back to China. And when he came back, he was skeptical as to whether he would be allowed to, whether the emperor would be unhappy with him. But he was welcomed with, open arms as a scholar. And not only that, he had a very successful career later on as a sort of religious preacher to the Chinese empress. Okay, now, Mark, I'm using the word empress, not emperor. Okay, so that's another interesting story that, okay, so, and he traveled to the famous Heart Sutra, or called the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the big, strand of Buddhism. Okay, and he took as many as 600 to 700 books that he took along with it. Okay, and at the same time, that and there were other schools of religious learning that we'll talk about. Okay, I talked about the Takshashila, which was on the northwest part of India, but in the foothills of Himalayas, there was another religious, one could say in the modern term, Nalanda University, that was a center for learning. And this again, was destroyed by the Islamic invasions. Okay, and this, you can just say, this was actually a thing that where you had to take admission tests to get into it. Okay, you had to qualify as a scholar to learn the Buddhist scriptures as well as the other disciplines. So you can say that this was one of the first official sort of type of university, or whatever you want to call it. And people came from all over the eastern world to study Buddhism and other disciplines. Okay, and not only that people stayed there for years. Okay, and Huan Sung spent almost, and that words had already told that a scholar is coming from China. So he was welcomed by the head monks with open arms. And he spent several years there, translating the Buddhist text. Okay, and these universities, and these were excavated later on. You can see some of the ruins of Nalanda University, and they're almost like the construction was similar to like having like a quad at Cambridge. Okay, there was an open discussion thing, and Huan Sung writes that monks had actually almost like a Oxford Union debate, so to speak. So they just got together and argued religious things until they were blue in the face, So, okay, so this is, and they had one of the biggest libraries of scholarly books that were there. Okay, and unfortunately, so this is almost next to Alexandria. Okay, and this was again, destroyed by the Islam, and again was less utilized with the change in the religious doctrines, and was destroyed by the Mughals, by the Muslim, not the Mughal is the wrong word, Muslim Sultanate, which managed to conquer Delhi around 1100 or 1200 current era. Okay, And then, obviously they were rather, instrumental in destroying some of these places of learning. Okay, and this is just the comparison of the two universities. Okay, and so where they are located, how they are founded, and what was taught. Okay, I'm sorry, Nalanda should be on the other side, but it tells you about how. Okay, so the tradition of learning was well established in both. Now this is an interesting story that I learned that from uh, William Dalrymple's book. Okay, and she was actually a concubine. Okay, to the Taizan, the emperor. Okay, and she was like a third or fourth concubine or mistress, whatever you want to call it, and had enough political or palace savvy that after the emperor suffered stroke, okay, and was able to maneuver the court in being crowned an empress. So you can say that she was the only woman empress in the entire long thousands of years history of China. And this was, and obviously, she was a force to be reckoned with, and during the Tang dynasty, and she controlled for a number of years. And somewhere along the line, she had, developed attachment or affection for Buddhism. So almost supported Buddhism throughout China, made it almost like a state religion at the cost of Confucian and Taoism. And at the same time, the Buddhist monks or scholars who were losing their foothold in India, they were glad to go and find employment or preaching or position of power in China. Okay, so this was just worked out, and not only that, this is staged as an opera in China. You can just see the modern Chinese version of it, that they are unlike the communist era, they've adopted it as their cultural history. So it was, and she was, and this is the soap opera. Basically, this was this is still staged and very popular in China and was made into a film. Okay, and she supported a lot of these caves that we talked about. Okay, the Longmen Cave and grottos that we talked about, in the Henan province. Okay. So you get the idea that this was, a fairly big place for and people, this is still a big place of worship for the Buddhists from all over the Eastern world. Okay, and okay. And these are some of the ocean trade routes, just as a refresher type of thing that goes along, from Arabia all the way to, the western, to the western side of India. Okay, and then later on, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, okay, people started looking for trade and primarily for gold and for cultural influence to the east. So that is going to be the next big part of our this thing, the fall of the Rome. Okay, when the Huns attacked, Roman Empire, and they were basically again, so that was the end. And at the same time, the Byzantine Empire and Persia were at loggerheads with each other, and they fought several wars. Some trade continues, but it was dwindling by that time. Okay, okay, and so this was, so that's when people started looking for the merchant guilds that were started in South India, started looking for what we call Suvarna Bhumi, means land of gold, to Sumatra and Java. Okay, and also obviously by that time they already had Sri Lanka. Okay, and so they started looking, further, to Southeast Asia for trade. Okay, and at the same time, along with trade, religious influence, started spreading as well. Okay. Now, at the same time, so this was the this thing that took about, the Islam in India around 711 after the caliphates. The Muhammad, had his vision in 640, and pretty quickly they were able to capture the whole of Arabia and march within a span of 100 years. Now, originally the caliphs were not too much interested, but there was some border conflict, either with paying taxes or dues. And again, it's so trade route. So that's when they decided that, okay, well, perhaps we should look at East. So that's when the first foothold took place in what is modern day Sindh, okay, or Pakistan. And at the same time, there was a lot of fragmentation, and they had, they were a lot more ferocious, and there's better technology of horses. Okay, because in the Indian subcontinent originally, when the uh, uh, Aryan migration took place, there were horses, but horses did not do too well in the subcontinent. So all along, horses have been imported from Arabia. Okay, so later on, there was a big element of trade that took place. So, and obviously the Arabs were better organized than the local kings. They had also gunpowder technology by that time. They had learned that from the Chinese. So that was a big shift in the balance of power that took place. Okay, because fighting with gunpowder versus swords and elephants came out at the loser's end. So, and so this was the rise of Islam in India around 700 current era. And at the same time, with the collapse of the Persian Empire, okay, the people who are of Zoroastrian faith migrated to India, and they're called Parsis or Zoroastrians, okay, and they were well accepted, and this is again, I mentioned about Nietzsche's "Thus Spake Zarathustra" that all of you have heard about, and that's a relatively small community, but unfortunately the problem is, that you cannot convert into Zoroastrian and Muslim Parsis, okay, so their numbers are dwindling, and they marry amongst each other. So that's another reason for there are a lot more, their numbers are quietly dwindling, so to speak. And they're some of the biggest trading houses in India, called Tata. They're owned by the Parsis. And the one person that you may recognize was the lead singer of the group Queen, Freddie Mercury, was a Zoroastrian. Okay, so he grew up in India, and then later on went to Britain to study economics, but decided Iraq was much more his liking. So that's a story. And obviously, the other famous Parsi that you may or may not have heard about was the music director Zubin Mehta, who was the director of the New York Philharmonic for several years back in the, I should say, 80s. Yeah, 80s. And at the same time, there were, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews had, they were, from the Middle East, they were trading. And as early as 70 current era, the Jews have been in South India. Okay. And there have been temples and synagogues. Okay. And again, and then the second migration that took place was when they fell out of the Sultanate, out of favor of the Sultanate, they migrated around 1000 current era. Okay, so there are two migrations. And unfortunately, there are also the race and color. This is the southern Jews are considered the black Jews, the northern ones are considered white Jews. So that discrimination still continues. So they're still, and they figure widely in the terrorist attack that took place in Bombay or Mumbai around 2008, where the people from Pakistan migrated with boats and attacked the big railway terminus and a couple of synagogues in Bombay. So there was a huge terror attack that took place in 2008. So that's equivalent to 2001. That most of the Indians would remember that. Okay, and the fascinating history of some of these, that the one name that you may recognize was Sassoon. Okay, the famous poet during the First World War was David Sassoon, and the Sassoons were the big opium traders, and they successfully established. They made the modern day Shanghai. So there's a book that just came out about 4 or 5 years ago. The Jews, the kings of Shanghai. Okay, and there were the two Jewish families that came from modern day Iraq or Mesopotamia, as it was called in those days, and they came initially to Bombay, and and thrived under the British law. Okay, became big opium merchants and traders, and then successfully, during the opium trade, marched and established foothold in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Okay, so it's a fascinating story about the kings of Shanghai. Okay, and obviously they lost a lot of their wealth with the Japanese invasion. Okay, and they still had a very much presence in Shanghai. Okay, so the Sassoons were a big charity organization in central India, and that is the Sassoon Docks, Sassoon Hospital, Sassoon Libraries. So they were and they adopted the English lifestyle and trade very quickly, and their charities are well known in Western India. So that's another sidekick about the cultural mixture that took place. Let's see, we're doing well. And at the same time, Armenians, okay, the Armenians got around into India as well, as early as 700. Merchant named Thomas Canna, okay, and then later on they were big into Mughal emperors. Okay, and they were well accepted by the Muslim emperors. Okay, and last but not the least, in the city where I was born, called Surat on the west coast, I did not realize that there is an Armenian cemetery, and it's still very much a place of visit, so to speak. There's a Dutch cemetery, Armenian cemetery, okay, and obviously the English. So it was as to how much cultural mixture that took place, it's just fascinating. Okay, and at the same time, the rise of the House of Wisdom, that is the rise of the Islamic culture that took place in the early days of Caliphate in Baghdad, that took place, because Baghdad had huge libraries and has scholarly traditions. Okay, in the early days of Islam, it was the center of learning that took place. Okay, and again, they were tolerant to and the one person that became of interest was Baramkids. These were the Buddhists from modern day Balkh, which is in northern Afghanistan. And then later on, they converted to Islam and went to the court of the Caliph, around 750 current era, and were able to translate a lot of the Indian Sanskrit text into Arabic, including astronomy, mathematics, and religion, and Ayurveda. Okay, so this was an interesting mixture that the Baramkid Sanskrit literal family of Buddhist heredity from Afghanistan converted to Islam and became the wazir, means, the chief sort of ministers of the caliph, Abbasid Caliphate. Okay. And they also appear in Arabian Nights as well as in Disney. That I did not know that. This is from William Dalrymple's book. And they brought, the mathematics and numbers. So the so-called Arabic numerals traveled from India to Middle East and later on to Europe. Okay. And so this is, and this was during the days of the famous Arabian Nights, the caliph that I'm sure if you have read Arabian Nights anywhere, either in the movies or in books, Harun al-Rashid. And then somewhere along the line, after his death, these poor wazirs fell out of favor and they were beheaded. So that was the tragic end to their scholarship or diplomacy. I think we should probably stop here, and because I think I'm slightly ahead of my time, and then we can continue next time, type of thing. Because okay, I think because and okay, well, I'll see you guys next time, and I'm a little ahead of my schedule because I think my fault is I always talk too fast. Yeah, listening to a lecture from University of Washington by a biologist who is 85 years old, and he talks so slow. I said, I'm almost falling asleep. It's a nice talk about germs, So, but it's absolutely, really very slow pace, and he reads all his slides. So I said, I could read them very easily. So why am I sitting there? So I sat there yesterday from 4 to 6, because of the time difference. It's a nice talk about microbes and other stuff. So I think we should probably, quit a little ahead of the time. I don't think, that. Okay. And I will stop the recording, stop the share, and continue next time because